Um, this is because it's quite an important idea that Fodor is setting out in that article. But the way it's set out is incredibly complicated and convoluted. Everything else in the reader, you can really, it really is a good idea to spend hours and weeks on. The main idea in Fodor is very simple, and I'm going to set it out right now, and very important. But I'm not really sure that the tangle of technicality with which Fodor sets it up is really justified. So I'm not necessarily recommending to you that you spend long hours in the Fodor. If you think you got the key idea here, then that's great, and that should be enough. There's something else I was going to say. Oh yeah, at the end of next week, on Friday next week, we'll be starting in on the Wittgenstein. And I've stopped labouring the point that you have to do the reading as well as coming to the lectures. But with the Wittgenstein, it would really be, it would be as if you went to a class in Shakespeare and thought, well, I can kind of figure out what's going on in the plays from the lectures. I never really had time to read that stuff. It would just be a real shame to do. You won't get the sense of it properly from the lectures. With the Wittgenstein particularly, you owe it to yourself to read the stuff as well as, though luminously lucid though the lectures are. Okay, there's also a kind of tradition that at some point in the class you should be exposed to someone who actually knows something about the subject. And I know this is kind of controversial, but we're going to break with tradition. And Justin on Monday is going to talk about is going to talk about logic and conversation. Grace on implicature, on the way that meaning works in ordinary conversation. So this will give a kind of real, what should I say, ordinary social talk, kind of grounding, kind of connect for what we've been doing so far. And there won't be a lecture on Wednesday. I'm actually away then. And then on Friday, we will start in on the Wittgenstein. Okay, so is that clear what the agenda is? Okay. So today, Dretske and Fodor on meaning in the world order. And I want to begin with a kind of generalization of the problem we had for Dretske last time. This is really Fodor's way of setting up the general problem that Dretske was addressing. So Fodor talks about the disjunction problem. I'll then go on and just review Dretske's solution again in those terms. Then look at Fodor's example of the way the disjunction problem arises. And then finally, the important thing in Fodor, his causal asymmetry theory. But I want to begin with just what the general issue is that all these theories are addressing. The idea is, if the use of language is part of the ordinary physical world, if it's not something imported into the physical world by ectoplasm or souls or something, if it's really just a natural phenomenon, then it should be possible to say something like this. There are standards of right and wrong for sentences. Sentences can be true or false in virtue of, and then what goes into the blank space here should be something from the natural sciences, something about the way that all the molecules are configured. You see what I mean? It should be possible to get something like that. If meaning really is just part of the physical world, then it should be possible to specify in physical terms what's going on when you say there are standards of rightness or wrongness for sentences. How it comes about that you can go right or wrong in using a sentence. And the way we've been simplifying this, I mean, what should I say? It's not simplification in the sense of a distortion, but taking getting the problem down to its most basic cases. As we've been saying, let's consider what it takes for the sign x to refer to x's. And then the general picture we've got is x is referred to x, the sign x refers to x's, in virtue of the fact that production of the sign x is typically caused by x's. I mean, that is brutally simple, but that's a nonetheless accurate statement of where we've got to so far after all these weeks. It's something like that. And that looks okay because x being typically caused by x's, that's part of the natural world, right? That's just what goes on in the ordinary non-supernatural physical world. Things cause each other. So those physical signs, x's, can be caused by the phenomenon of x's, and then x will refer to x's, and that's how come you get your standard of right and wrong. Right? If you've got all the signs referring to things, then you're on your way to an account of how the use of sentences can be right or wrong. Right? You recognize that? That's where we've got to? Yeah. And then the problem is, suppose that what happens is that x's cause x to be produced, but then there are lookalikes. There are things that you might think are x's, but are not really x's. Things you can be taken in by. Those will also cause the sign x to be produced. But then, in that case, why should we say that the sign x refers only to xness rather than to x or yness? So the problem's very, very general. Even if you state it in these brutally simple terms, you can see that this is going to be a very general problem. And then, in fact, anything that causes the sign x to be produced can be added in here. So you're going to lose that distinction between getting it right and getting it wrong. Anything that makes you produce the sign x will count as what you're using the sign x to refer to. So the causal theory, actually, it looks like it's saving us. We're getting an account of how there can be standards of right and wrong. But when you see this problem coming up, it looks like the existence of standards of right and wrong, the distinction between right and wrong, is just going to be obliterated. So we've got to distinguish between two kinds of cause. You state it in this general way. It seems quite clear that what we've got to do is distinguish between one kind of cause for the production of a sign, the kind of cause that fixes the reference of the sign, and then the lookalikes, the causes of the production of the sign that might fall outside the reference of the sign. So this is another way of stating, a more general way of stating, the problem that was facing Dretske last time. The rule is, I mean, the way the problem's stated, we've got to draw that distinction in naturalistic terms. We can't just leave it there. We can't just appeal to reference to explain this distinction. We've got to say what that comes to, that distinction, in ordinary physical terms. Yeah?
Can you just go back one slide for
Yep. Okay. Okay. Okay, so we've got to explain what that comes to, using only terms that don't involve meaning or right and wrong, terms that just unproblematically relate to the natural world. So it's not just that we can single out one kind of causation. We should be able to see why that kind of causation matters for reference fixing, because we want to be able to understand how it is that that kind of cause could be fixing the standards of right and wrong. I mean, if you said, well, the kind of causation that matters for reference fixing is the kind of causation that's involved when light of a certain electromagnetic radiation within certain particular wavelengths is involved. Well, maybe that would work. You know, maybe you could get it coming out just right. That's when you've got reference and when you haven't. But you would have no idea why why electromagnetic radiation within those wavelengths was just the one that mattered for fixing reference. We wanted to be illuminating here why this kind of causation should matter for fixing reference. So naturalistic is one thing, but it's not enough that the answer be naturalistic. We should be able to see its connection to the existence of standards of right and wrong for the sentences we're using. And on the other hand, if we just left it like this, sometimes causes of the production of X fix the references of X. Sometimes causes of the production of X don't fix the references of X. And we just left it there. That will give the right answer. And you can see what it has to do with standards of right and wrong. But it's not naturalistic. It just appeals to the notion of reference that we're trying to explain. Okay? So we want it to be both naturalistic and to be illuminating about why there are standards of right and wrong in the first place. So that's the general problem. That all right? Does that sound reasonably what should I say? It's not familiar exactly, but recognizable. Okay, so Dretske's form. Well, remember Dretske's. Let me just restate. Dretske's form of the problem was you've got stuff like you have the case where you have the humble magnetosome, and what's causing the magnetosome to point straight ahead is, let's say, the geomagnetic north is straight ahead. And then you say, well, there are causes of the magnetosome pointing straight ahead that don't fix the reference here, like local magnetic north, like the use of the bar magnet. And then someone says, but why don't we collapse these two and say that the structure pointing straight ahead refers to either geomagnetic north being straight ahead or local magnetic north being straight ahead, right? That is just that Dretske's problem. And Dretske's solution was that we got to have multiple routes to the firing of the structure. You only have a structure determinately referring R's firing determinately refers to F. Only if there are multiple routes to the firing of R, and the system is capable of learning new routes to the firing of R, so that we can't say it's either, if this is what's going on in the skin of the animal, then we can't say it's either I1 or I2 or I3 or I4. We can always find a new path that would take you beyond those that disjunction. And as it was better put last time, actually, by people in the class, that if you've got it set up so it's capable of associative learning, there must be something in the system that's making it capable of associative learning that is responding specifically to Fness. And when you think about it, that is, you might think that actually is too good an answer at that point, because you might think that shows that the structure, in order to be talking about associative learning of new ways of telling whether something is F, the system's already got to be capable of representing Fness, and we're actually just presupposing that the problem's been solved. To know that the structure is capable of associatively learning new ways of representing Fness, we already have to know that it's representing Fness. But then we're just helping ourselves to the idea that the problem's been solved, that the thing is representing Fness. But anyway, there are further problems. This thing actually teems with problems once you start thinking about it. The key, it is really key to Dretske's account that suppose you just said, well, the structure will fire in response to Fness, and then if there's a certain amount of jiggery-pokery, it will also fire when these new pathways are engaged. Then that's just a causal description of the situation. That just describes what is happening here. Yeah? Then you say, now, why should that bit of biology have anything to do with getting it right or getting it wrong? You might say, this is naturalistic, all right, but it doesn't explain how right and wrong are involved. And it's here that this is what's so intuitive about Dretske appealing to the idea of function, that if you know what the thing is for, then you got the notion that there could be right or wrong. So you want to be able to say if the biological function of the state is to indicate Fness, then the state's referring to Fness. And if it's not the biological function of the state to indicate G-ness, then it doesn't refer to G. So if it's the biological function of the state to indicate Fness, and it goes into that state when there's nothing F around, then it's made a mistake. The thing is malfunctioning. So you explain rightness and wrongness of the informational content of the system in terms of the function. But this, what does it mean, function? This is the thing I was saying last time about mistakenly believing that you're popular, or mistakenly believing that you have a lot of control over what's going on around you. It might be that we have systems whose biological function is served by producing those illusions. But that's what they are. They are illusions. The optimality of biological function is one thing, and the optimality of truth seems to be a different thing. I mean, we want standards of right and wrong, but not just any standard of right and wrong will do. Another way to put it, someone was just putting it to me like this morning, is that on the face of it, this is a very selfish way to think about language, that after all that's being served by getting it right or wrong, by the biological functions here, are my objectives, my needs. The whole thing is being anchored back to the serving of my needs. So if I make a remark to you, then in this picture, what standards of right and wrong are appropriate here? Well, only whether the thing serves my needs. But of course, whether the thing serves my needs might have nothing to do with whether what I've said to you is true or false. It may be that my needs are best served by you believing something false that I just said, right? I mean, that's the sorry truth about the way the world works, right? Sometimes it may be biologically optimal for me to tell you something false. So, although Dretske's account is really ingenious in the way it appeals to function, to connect the biological facts to right and wrong, it's not obvious that the rightness or wrongness that connects to biological function is the same as the ordinary standards of truth and falsity that we have for sentences. So it may be that the whole approach is just a mistake anyhow. In fact, it seems to me the whole thing is just a mistake anyhow. But there's obviously room for some maneuver here. You could try to rescue the theory. But my own hunch is that this is not going to work. This is going to get too complicated and not going to work. But I don't know. I should tell you too that there are many, many people working on this at the moment who think it's only a matter of time before something like this turns out to be correct. Okay, so that's Dretske's solution and some dismissive remarks about it. Is that plain enough what the problems are at any rate for Dretske's solution? Not really? Okay. So I said one kind of problem is with the way this multiple roots thing is meant to work. Doesn't it already have to have a way of determinately representing Fness in order to be capable of associatively learning new ways of detecting Fness? That's all right. That problem's all right? Yeah, comfortable with that? Okay. And then the next problem is when you try and meet this constraint, I said if we're going to single out a particular type of causation and say that's the one that matters for reference fixing, it mustn't be just an appeal to the involvement of electromagnetic radiation of particular wavelengths, for example. We've got to understand what it's got to do with right and wrong. That constraint is okay. Is that all right? You've got to pause me if this does not make perfect sense. Yeah? Well, it doesn't make perfect sense.
Yeah.
Okay. What's wrong? What in the world could be plainer than that? Suppose I say, okay, sentences can be right or wrong, right? We get true or false for sentences up here. And we're looking at the biological, physical world down here. Yeah? And I say, a sentence is true just in case it's associated with electromagnetic radiation with a frequency of 850 nanometers, right? And you say, okay, now I understand. I mean, the puzzle is, how can there be standards of right and wrong in the ordinary physical world? There are the laws governing the way everything behaves. How does it come about that there's such a thing as getting it right or wrong? That puzzle I've been stating right since the start of the class. That puzzle is plain enough. Okay. Well, now suppose I just single out some arbitrary set of physical facts, like the ones that involve this kind of wavelength. And I say that's when you've got something right. And all the rest is when you get something wrong. And you say, now we see. But you don't see. It doesn't make any sense. Why should that have anything to do with getting it right? Why should this have anything to do with getting it wrong? Why shouldn't it be round the other way? Why shouldn't it be some quite different collection of physical facts that matter? We want to understand whatever the base class of physical facts is that we're appealing to. We want to understand why plausibly they have something to do with the standards of right and wrong that we usually apply to sentences in communication and in thinking. There's got to be a connect there. You couldn't put it any plainer than that. Right? That's okay? Okay, you let that pass now. Okay, right. Okay, and now we look at Dretske and we say, okay, I said there's this problem about how the associative learning thing is meant to work. But suppose we just bypass that. Suppose you say, okay, we'll give you that. Right? Then what's happening here? All that's happening is that you have a structure that fires in response to these signals, and there's lots of other signals it fires in response to, and we're singling out one subset here and saying, those are the ones where it's getting it right, and giving another subset, and we say, those are the ones where it's getting it wrong. But what have they got to do with rightness and wrongness? We haven't explained that yet. That's okay? That's plain as day? Okay. And then this is the beauty of Dretske's appeal to biological function. Because look, biological functions look like they're part of the ordinary physical world. Even in the ordinary physical world, you've got to say, look, as someone said, hearts have the function of pumping blood. Yeah? So it surely must be all right to say we can appeal to biological function down here to explain what's going on. But biological function has got something to do with rightness and wrongness. If you're serving your function, you're getting it right. If you're not serving your function, you're getting it wrong. Bingo! We made the connect. That's the idea of Dretske's theory. That notion of function lets you make the connect between the natural world and the standards of truth and falsity for ordinary talk. You can see that there are going to be these structures in the brain that all have biological functions, structures in the visual system that all have biological functions of indicating stuff around you. And then in communication, it's just more of the same. The words you're using just have these biological functions. Language is a biological organ. I mean, the language capacity is like a biological organ. It's an organ of your brain that's tuned to bits of your environment. That's what you use it for. And so you get it right or wrong, depending on whether those bits of your biology are serving their function. It's a great idea, right? You see, that if I've explained that right, it should seem like a good idea. Yeah? But for that to be correct, for that to work, then consider the way that an ordinary sentence can be true or false. Is that the same thing as the biological function of some organ you have being served? That's where that stuff about popularity and believing you're in control comes in. That may be biologically optimal. Believing you're very popular may be biologically optimal. Believing that you're in control even when you're not may be biologically optimal. But there's another sense, the sense in which we have standards of truth and falsity, in which it's not optimal, it's false. Illusions could be biologically optimal. So that suggests that the strategy is not going to work. We've got the appeal to function gives you a kind of right and wrong. That's all right. But the trouble is, it doesn't look like it's the same right and wrong as truth and falsity. Is that better? Okay, plain as day. I mean, back where we started, right? But with that one small problem. Okay. Okay, so what I want to do now is look at Fodor's example, Fodor's way of setting out this problem. And then go on to look at Fodor's way of giving a solution to it. So here's Fodor. Fodor says, I see a cow which, stupidly, I misidentify. I take it to be a horse. So taking it causes me to say, horse. This is an extremely implausible example, but it may help if I mean, I think it is fair to say that Fodor is a city boy and dislikes and distrusts the countryside. And it's actually not that implausible given the individuals involved. Yeah, okay. I mean, there are plenty of examples of this kind of thing. I mean, another example of Fodor's actually is the frog that whenever a fly goes past it, whaps out its tongue, right? That's very adaptive, right? So then the scientist gets a small black piece of cotton wool and draws it in front of the frog, and the frog's tongue whaps out, and you say, ha ha, fooled you. Gotcha there. That's an analogous case. But of course, then the same problem comes up. Is what we've got here, is the frog representing flies and making a mistake? Or does the frog just represent small round black objects and whap out at everything that it identifies as a small round black object? And often enough, they turn out to be flies. You see what I mean? This same problem is easy to generate lots of examples of. Okay, but this is Fodor's. So, what? Sorry. Okay, so here we are anyway. Here is Fodor stupidly misidentifying a cow and taking it to be a horse, saying horse. So he says, we want it to be that my utterance of the word horse means horse in virtue of the causal relation between, at any rate, some horse tokenings and horses. That's okay? That's the way the causal theory works. It's got to work like that. And in fact, if it doesn't work like this, nobody has any idea what to say. Yeah. So it must be something like that. So when he says we want it there, I think that's actually quite persuasive. We do want that because we don't have any idea how to go about explaining how meaning works if it's not that. I mean, suggestions are welcome, but, you know, unless you think of something, then I don't know of any other good idea. But on the other hand, he says, although the odd appearance of cows will occasionally cause utterances of horse, we don't want it to be that my utterance of horse means cow in virtue of the causal relations between some horse tokenings and cows. So the situation is, the causal relations look just the same. Horse causes you to say horse. Cow causes you to say horse. So the causal relations are the same. And if causation is the basis of representation, then why aren't the semantic connections just the same too? Why doesn't horse stand for cow just as well as it stands for horse. What's going on? There must be something we missed here. Because we said the causal connection is what generates standards of right and wrong. The causal connection is what generates reference. So why doesn't it generate reference in the horse-cow case too? Yep.
Isn't this a completely different kind of causal relation than they were actually talking about in the causal theory of reference? Because it seemed like in the causal theory of reference, it wasn't that I saw an object and it caused me to identify it as having this name, that somebody actually dubbed this kind of object has this name, and the causal chain is one of being this name being communicated to
Right.
other people. So it's, I don't see how that is really a response to is really an objection
Yeah.
to the causal theory.
That is interesting. So you have an initial dubbing ceremony, yeah? Yeah, I mean, suppose this happens. Suppose that we have taken Fodor for a trip in the country, right? Now, very influential Fodor, right? Now, at this point, let's suppose it's some kind of Stone Age Fodor, right? But at this point, no one. I mean, the reason I make it the Stone Age is let's suppose that no one has yet given the species of horses a definite name, right? And Fodor sees a cow and says, "Let's call them horses." But the people around him take it that he means to be identifying horses. They just use the word horse thenceforth to identify horses. In fact, that's down to the present day. The initial dubbing ceremony just happened to involve a cow. Does that mean we're all making a mistake when we say horse? Because actually, the word, did we but know it, it really applies only to cows. Or does it mean that it applies to both horses and cows? Or is the initial dubbing ceremony, it just doesn't matter anymore?
Well, it seems like in a case like that, there's something going on, and I can't really pin it down, but analogous to the case with Spot.
That's right. That's exactly right. You're right.
Yeah.
There's an unintended shift of reference. Yeah. Right. It is like the Spot case and it's like the Madagascar case. Yeah? You remember Madagascar? Dear old Madagascar.
I think that might have been what I was about to say.
All right. Everybody else remembers Madagascar. Happy days. No? Well, right. Okay, anyway, Spot. Right, you remember Spot. Okay. The point is, if there can be unintended shift of reference, yeah, it robs the initial dubbing ceremony of its significance. It means that even when there isn't an unintended shift of reference, the important thing for what the standards of right and wrong governing the term are what's going on now. Yeah? And what's going on now is this kind of mixed situation that sometimes the word horse has been used in response to horses, and sometimes it's been used in response to cows.
Well, even then, I think it's even without the initial dubbing ceremony, I think what I took to be essential to the causal theory of reference was the means by which the names were learned, the causal chain according
Fine,
to
yeah.
acquire them. And this doesn't seem to be addressing that causal chain. It seems to be addressing the causal chain of what causes me to recognize something as having a name.
Yeah, it is addressing the second. The first thing is interesting. I mean, that is a kind of thing that you might give as a theory to explain the distinction here, right? Because then you say, well, the causal relations are not the same. Yeah? So just working with this kind of on the run, you might say the causal relations that matter for reference are the ones that figure in the learning of the word, and the ones that happen later, well, they might be just mistakes. Yeah? That has some life, that has some promise, that is a theory. I mean, the immediate problem that occurs to me is that if you think about a child, I mean, a child learning to use a word will look at practically anything and say practically anything. It looks at the desk and it says pig. You see what I mean? If you go back too far in learning, then you just get then it would turn out that practically any word is referring to practically anything. Yeah, you'd have to hit some golden age in the life of the child just after it's all that jumble, but before it started to make mistakes. Before it started to call the cows horses. Yeah, but there may be no such golden age. Yeah, but that's just the problem that occurs to me immediately. I don't want to say that could you might not be able to work through that. Yeah, but that is the right shape of a solution. Yeah. Plain enough what the problem is. Any other solutions? If anything is popping into your head as surely you could say this, then that would be interesting. It's a really hard problem, right? Is that is that a correct summary of the mood of the meeting? That is a real problem, and it's a really hard problem. Yeah.
Learning would be the answer, sir. That we would have to admit that actually learning stops at some point. We wouldn't be able
To keep on learning.
keep on learning and sort of defining more sophisticated distinctions.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I'm not sure if that's a helpful remark in the sense that it actually makes it worse rather than better. But I actually agree. There is some sense in which we all carry on learning our language as long as we live. I mean, you say maroon. Maroon, I never thought that was maroon. Would you call that maroon? Do you see what I mean? Even for very simple terms, you can keep getting better as time goes on. Is that the kind of case you have in mind?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very simple example. You take something like democracy. I wouldn't call that democracy. Would you call that is that democracy? You see what I mean? I mean, there are lots of more interesting and subtle cases where, yeah, it's very hard to say this is where learning has stopped. Yeah. Okay. You can come back at any point. Okay, let's look at Fodor's solution. This is causal asymmetry. Okay, so the idea is, here's the problem. Here's a diagram of the problem. You have a causal path from horses to the production of the word horse. You have a causal path from cows to the production of the word horse. And you want it to be that only this causal path fixes reference. So you've got to have some way of explaining what's different about the two kinds of causal path. And here's Fodor's idea. Fodor's idea is once this causal path, it's actually not a million miles away from the learning suggestion, but once this causal path from horses to the word horse is set up, then as a result of the word being used in this way, it will happen that sometimes you get taken in by a lookalike and produce the word horse in response to the lookalike too. So this causal connection comes in on the back of this causal connection. It was only because Fodor had established in his head that causal link between the horses and the word horse that he was then able to be taken in and produce the word horse in response to cows. So this causal connection depends on this causal connection. Your ability to be taken in by a lookalike depends on your ability to recognize the real thing. On the other hand, suppose that we took away your ability to, suppose that we trained Fodor. So, suppose we took him aside and spent an afternoon and we said, look, that's not what you'd call a horse. This one we call a cow. Cow, right? You spend a few hours on this kind of thing. And so you take away this causal connection, right? That leaves this causal connection intact. So if you the causal path here depends on the causal path here, but the causal path here does not depend on the causal path here. If you took away this one, this would still last. But if you took away this one, that one would go away, because that one only came in the back of this one. Right? If you said, I mean, how would you take this away? You'd say something like, we've decided it's equinism to call these things horses. We decided that this is there's something objectionable about it, right? We're not going to do that anymore. Okay, I'm not going to get into what we will do. But suppose you said we're going to take this away, then you'd stop saying the word horse in response to cows too. If you weren't going to call horses horse, you wouldn't be taken in by the cows anymore in that way. Okay, so the idea is, if horses didn't cause the word horse to be produced, then cows would not cause the word horse to be produced either. You're following me very closely here. Okay, that's all right. Yeah. But even if cows didn't cause the word horse to be produced, even if we were all trained out of our ability to be taken in by cows, still horses would cause the word horse to be produced. So, in that sense, this depends on this, but this does not depend on this. So the situation is asymmetric. There is an asymmetric dependence of this on this. Yeah? Okay. So this is Fodor. The causal connection between cows and the word horse is asymmetrically dependent on the causal connection between horses and the word horse. Okay. And then the theory is, I mean, you can see what the theory is going to be now. If there's an asymmetric dependence between horses causing X and cows causing X, so that this one, cows causing X, is causally dependent on horses causing X, well, that dependent causation here, where the cows are causing the use of the word X, that dependent causation is a causation of mistakes. And it's the one that is not asymmetrically dependent that is fixing the reference. Let me see. Okay. So putting it in terms of possible, you remember possible worlds? Possible worlds? Or for some reason they're now blue. They used to be green. But anyway, our little blue friends. As you know, some possible worlds are closer to the actual world than others. And what we're saying is, in the nearest worlds in which horses don't cause the word horse to be produced, cows don't cause the word horse to be produced. If you imagine what it would be like if horses weren't causing the word horse to be produced, then cows wouldn't be causing the word horse to be produced, because the only reason they cause the word horse to be produced is that they look kind of like horses. So if you'd taken away this one, you'd have taken away that one too. The nearest worlds in which horses don't cause the word horse, cows don't cause the word horse. And there are the nearest worlds in which that's happening, helpfully picked out for you. Okay? Now you understand? Okay. I knew you might find it a bit difficult unless I did that. Okay. But round the other way, in the nearest worlds in which, and here they are, in the nearest worlds in which cows don't cause the word horse to be produced, horses still cause the word horse to be produced. because the nearest worlds in which cows don't cause a wild horse to be produced are worlds in which everyone's been through a lot of brisk training in how to tell horses from cows, and so they're not taken in anymore. But they still will be caused to use the word horse by the horses. Okay, so there's no appeal to function here. There's no appeal to associative learning. It's a very simple, elegant theory. I mean, in a way, it's better than Dretske's for this reason. I mean, there's another way which is better than Dretske's, which is, I said that if you think, here's the world of biological facts, and here's the world of truth and falsity, and how do we connect the two? It's very plausible that function will help you connect the two. You might say, well, that actually is just a cheat, really, because when you're really describing the natural world, talking about function shouldn't be there anyhow. It's like talking about the selfish gene. It's a kind of colourful way to describe what's going on, to talk as if the organs of the body are human artifacts like petrol pumps. But it's only a bunch of anthropomorphic talking to talk about the functions of biological organisms. I mean, all your organs do is they just do what they do. And it's us projecting something onto them to say, this is what they're meant to do. Who meant them to do that? Actually, you don't have to answer that. But you might think that it's just really a cheat, the word function. Whereas this causal asymmetry theory doesn't appeal to any notion like that. It just takes a clean, bleak fact about the world. This causal connection is asymmetrically dependent on that causal connection, and says that's all there is to the existence of standards of truth and falsity. But the thing is, once you get to this point, there is a really obvious problem. The problem is, I've got this clean, bleak, austere distinction between two kinds of causal chain. The ones that are not asymmetrically dependent on anything else, and the ones that are asymmetrically dependent. And we're saying the ones that are asymmetrically dependent, they're the ones where you're getting it wrong, and the ones that are not asymmetrically dependent, they're the reference-fixing ones, the ones where you're getting it right. But why should that be? What's so good about not being asymmetrically dependent? I mean, if you were just told, look at this, you're doing a physics experiment, and you're told, look, the way some of the atoms behave is asymmetrically dependent on the way the other atoms behave. And you say, so those ones are getting it right? That would be a kind of madness. What's that distinction between two kinds of causal chain got to do with standards of right and wrong? And actually, once it sinks in what that problem is here, you see it's really quite general. If you really manage to describe the natural world in this clean, bleak, austere way, then you can never get standards of right and wrong out of it. I mean, if you just describe the world in purely naturalistic terms, I say that we're only talking about causal connections, or we're only talking about physics, or we're only talking about light of particular wavelengths, or we're only talking about how it is that some causal chains depend on others, which is Fodor's move, then how could you ever get standards of rightness and wrongness out of it? I mean, all that there is just the world going on in its way. But Fodor's theory is important, I think, because it's the clearest, cleanest, most explicit attempt to give a fully naturalistic account of where the standards of rightness and wrongness come from. But once you see what's happened with his theory, it starts to look like the naturalist project is just going to be impossible. Any account that really respects the rules of the game, that only talks about the way things actually go on in the world, the kind of laws that govern the world, the kind of causal connections that govern the world, is never going to be able to extract standards of rightness and wrongness from that. The only way it could even seem like it was going to work would be if you did something like using the notion of function that is kind of slippery. On the one hand, it's supposed to be just a description of what's really going on, and on the other hand, it brings in this idea of what the system is supposed to be doing, what the system is meant to be doing, and that just is a problem that we're trying to solve. So really, it's just a kind of cheat, actually. It just oscillates between being a clean notion and being one that presupposes the ideas we're trying to explain. But once you see, okay, we're not going to cheat, we're going to do the kind of thing Fodor is trying to do, then the minute you get it clear what the project is meant to be, the project looks hopeless. Okay, Wittgenstein gives a quite distinctive approach to the same problem, explaining where the standards of rightness and wrongness come from. And we'll start on that in the next unit. Meantime, logic and conversation on Monday. Okay? Okay, thank you.